Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So yesterday we talked about the robber barons, how these guys had come out and basically taken all the money in America, kind of for themselves. And then the real negative aspect of their monopolies is the fact that they are preventing other American citizens from experiencing the American dream, the idea that you can work really hard and be successful. So today we're going to start talking about how the United States society and the United States government is going to actively start pushing back against these robber barons and these monopolies in the United States in the late 1800s. Cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we got to talk about today is the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. So for this course, trust means monopoly. All right. So Anti-Monopoly Act means monopolies are bad. No more monopolies. Cool. Problem solved. No, this actually just makes it more complicated as far as teaching in history class and you learning in history class. So when people realized that monopolies or trust were bad, they actually passed a law saying you can't do that you can't have a monopoly. The problem is it wasn't enforced. So even though there was actually a law on the books and the United States government realized the monopolies were bad with the Rockefellers and Carnegies of the world because it negatively impacted the general everyday citizens in a variety of ways, they never actually enforced it. They never actually went to Rockefeller and Carnegie and told them you can't do this anymore. Why is that? Well, as everybody pretty much knew at the time, and I'll move out of the way so you can see this, Rockefeller and Carnegie owned the government. Now that's a little hyperbole, all right? That's not a fact. They didn't actually own the government, but they basically paid everybody that they wanted to win the elections. They paid for their campaigns. So everybody that's in the government likes Rockefeller and Carnegie because you pretty much can't get elected unless Rockefeller and Carnegie decide they want you to be in the government or, and especially, the president. So even if Congress got together and tried to punish Rockefeller and Carnegie, the president would just veto it. Because Rockefeller and Carnegie were so rich, they basically decided who they wanted to be the president, who they wanted to be in the Senate, and they just wrote big fat checks to their campaigns to make sure that they won the election. By doing so, they had complete and total control over the government. So while all the people in Congress are getting paid nice and healthy from Rockefeller and Carnegie, and the oil fields and the steel factories is definitely not the same thing. So the question here is, why was the Sherman Anti-Trust Act not enforced? So it's important to talk about this at the beginning here today because it wasn't, by this point they knew monopolies were bad. Just nothing was being done to stop them because the rich people had so much money they could basically go around the rules. So why was the Sherman Anti-Trust Act not enforced? Who's supposed to enforce it? The president? Congress? People that took a lot of money from Rockefeller and Carnegie. That's why it wasn't enforced. They were clearly consistently breaking the law, and the government at one point had decided they can't do this anymore, but they just don't enforce the law because they like Rockefeller and Carnegie's money that they provide to the government. So this basically means that the federal government that's supposed to be looking out, for the people, by the people, for the people, is completely just beholden to the people with money, like Rockefeller and Carnegie. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So this is where the story starts changing. This is where Americans kind of require the federal government to go in and make life better for the workers. So we've talked a lot about money here. The argument isn't poor people are like, I'm angry, I'm poor, give me rich people's money. It's definitely not that. Poor people are like, hey, I'm working for a nickel a day in a very dangerous factory that people are dying in because it's so dangerous. I think the owners of this factory should be required to make this factory safe that they're requiring me to show up in. That's the type of stuff that the workers are starting to demand at this point in the late 1800s. And a lot of progress is going to be made on those fronts. For that reason, this era is referred to as the Progressive era. all right, or progressivism, because progress is taking place as people move forward. So, kind of a put it all together here. Why was there a need for an era of progressivism? Well, horrible working conditions in the factories. People were going into the factories working like super young. So let me got some pictures here for you. Kids 6, 7, 8 years old were used in these factories, and it was absolutely awful work environments, working 15, 16 hours a day for a nickel a day. Everybody in the family had to work in these factories, not just in Rockefeller and Carnegie's, but basically this was the standard at the time. Is you basically have to work yourself to death so the super rich people can get all the money. All right. The dangers in the working environment in the factories. If you got sick or hurt or working on a machine that's clearly is the arm chopping off machine, it's just chop, 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 and they're like, you got to go work on that machine. Like, no. Obviously, I'm making that specific situation up, but forcing people to work on very dangerous situations, and the factory doesn't really care if you get hurt because they're paying you a nickel a day. Oh no, you got hurt, you can't work anymore. I'll just go outside and hire one of the other immigrants or other people that have just showed up into America, pay them a nickel a day, and they'll be more than happy to do the same job. So there's always some workers available to replace anybody that gets hurt. So there's no incentive for the workers to either get paid more, because if you ask for more money, they'll just fire you and hire somebody else off the street that is willing to work for a nickel a day. All right. So it's either work in a very dangerous environment for next to nothing, or don't have a job and then starve to death. That is basically the existence, and the people are tired of it. And the federal government needs to step in, because it's a government for the people, by the people. When the majority of people in the United States are living this way, this is not the American ideals. It doesn't matter how hard you work, you can't move up, which goes against the whole reason a lot of people had come to America, this American ideal of opportunity. So progressive people at the time, they want changes made. The big thing you have to understand here is they think that it should be the federal government's responsibility to go in and start regulating these trusts and stop this corruption and things from happening. The reason it's the government's responsibility is because in other revolutions that have happened throughout history, it's the people rise up and go kill a bunch of people, and it's really bad. The reason they want the government to do it is because as a government for the people, by the people should be able to control the government by voting, all right? So it should represent everybody equally. So progressive people, while some people thought it should be better pay in factories, some people thought it should be safer working conditions, some people thought child labor should be outlawed altogether. The things that the progressive people have in common all deal with the government having to get involved. Keep in mind, the government has this whole concept of laissez-faire economic policies where they're very hands-off. The people during the progressive era are like, no, you can't just ignore Rockefeller and Carnegie. You can't ignore these monopolies. You can't allow them to not enforce the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. The government has to get involved and make life better for the American citizens. That's the whole reason the government exists. All the good stuff in society should not be confined to a handful of people in our entire country. So the government should be more accountable, meaning they should, if bad things are happening in America, the government can't just be like, oh, don't know, that's the private sector. The government should stop the rich people from controlling, because Rockefeller and Carnegie, they're like literally picking the president. They are controlling everything, and they're picking the president because they decide who they want to be the president and then write them unlimited money, and money helps win campaigns in America. The government should be given more power in order to make life more fair for all the Americans. And then, and this is what this picture here is, there has to be more oversight in the government. If you give the government more power, you don't want it just to turn from Rockefellers and Carnegie's being corrupt to the government being corrupt. You give the government more power, there needs to be oversight in the government. So again, the progressive people really view this as the mentality at the time, where all the rich people are being held up and buoyed by the working class people, and the federal government a whole nother entity needs to come in and make this more equitable for all the people in the United States, not just letting the rich people have everything that they want. So the question here is, explain what the motivations were for the progressive era. Like, what's happening that makes this desire to make life better for the working class people? So explain some of the negative stuff here. And why is it so hard for workers to change their work environment at this time? So that might be a little obscure, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So the workers, if you're like, man, I don't like this work, and they go to their boss and basically go, I'm not going to work until you fix it. What's going to happen to that worker? They're going to get fired. Well, if all the workers got together, wink, wink, nod, nod, and said, we won't work again until you pay us more, there's not, this is 1,000 workers, not 1,000 workers outside that can be replaced. That's called a union, and unions get made illegal. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But workers have no control over their work environment at the time. There is no government intervention. It is worker and a business owner can do literally whatever he wants, and there's no oversight from the federal government. So pause me, answer that completely. So one of the most influential groups is a group called Muckrakers. Seems kind of weird. Muck means poop, and raking it, literally you're raking poop. These are journalists who, muckrakers do not lie, and that's really important because we're going to talk about another group of journalists called yellow journalists that do lie. Muckrakers, they're not liars, but they're only going to talk about the negative stuff in society, all right? And they do this so that it can bring to light how awful this stuff is in areas that might not be aware of it. And it's also really pointing it out to the government. This is the life that people are experiencing in the United States under this United States government who chooses not to do anything. Is this the government? Is this the society this government wants us to experience? All right. So this is a picture of Muckrakers. The guy here, that's Theodore Roosevelt. Let me back out of the way here. That is Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to talk about him quite a bit here in a few lessons. But muckrakers are people who really point out specific, really bad things in society and write about them and expose them to the rest of the world. The most famous, really, out of this time is a guy named Upton Sinclair. All right. So Upton Sinclair writes a book called The Jungle. Now, The Jungle itself is a fictional book, but everything, all the stories in his book that his character experiences are real experiences that are happening in a specific industry, the meat packing industry. So even though it's called The Jungle, it's like the concrete jungle. The Jungle is talking about the meat packing industry. And you're like, meat packing industry? What's that? It's literally an industry that packs meat. So this had come really popular in the late 1800s. As we had talked about previously with beef and cowboys trying to be spread around the country and having refrigerated railroad cars and trying to get the meat in different places before it spoils, they learned that packing it in a can and sealing it up preserves the meat almost indefinitely at the time. So canned meat was very common around the country. So they would make it in a factory and ship it all over the country, and it would not go bad, and people would open it up. They could cook their meat that came out of a can, just like this is corned beef, and then they could eat it. Cool. Nobody questioned how clean are these meat packing industries, right? So this is what the meat packing industry looks like. At the time. Now, before you're like, oh, that's so awful. There's really nothing negative in this picture. This is very close to how meat packing industries work today. Probably a little more sanitation, and we're going to talk about that because, man, I tell you what, in the late 1800s in the meat packing industry, it was not sanitary. So in this book, he talks about the things that take place in his meatpacking industry. Like people are standing here in ankle deep of blood, all right? As these like meat grinders or in this conveyor belts are just taking like hunks of meat, putting it into the grinder, grinding it up, and putting it into a can, which everybody knows that. Well, it would not be uncommon for somebody to get their hand caught in the grinder and take their hand off, all right? And that hand, as awful as it is for the person that lost the hand, it was a travesty. That hand got ground up and put in a can, and they wouldn't even stop it. And somebody somewhere in America ate a human hand and didn't even know it. It was absolutely disgusting. They talked about the amount of injuries that could happen in the meatpacking industry, and the meatpacking industry didn't even care because there's so many machines there that were called just grievous injuries. They would just leave at night and leave all the carcasses and blood and everything out and wouldn't clean up, and rats would get in there at night. So when they showed back up the next morning, coming in an ankle deep of blood, they're like turning the machines back on, and like rats are getting ground up in the grinder that's literally getting put in cans and shipped off all over the country. And people would eat it because the meatpacking industry is just trying to make money. That is their whole goal. That's Rockefeller, Carnegie, who they're not the meatpacking industry, but corporations in general, their entire goal is to make money. When the book The Jungle comes out, people get horrified by this and they're like, holy crap, what is happening? The meatpacking industry is the first one that's going to catch the eye of the federal government because of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. So, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, makes the government realize, oh wait, if we just completely ignore this, people will start getting sick around the country from unsanitary health practices, which is exactly what was happening. So, the first time the laissez-faire, the hands-off approach really gets broken, and the federal government's like, no, we need to get involved in this, is really with the food industry. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, comes out. If you've ever been to a restaurant and seen a sanitation grade on the wall, where the government comes in and checks and makes sure that place is serving safe and health and food that's not contaminated, that directly comes from The Jungle. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, is extremely influential in history because it's the first time across the board everybody realizes, yeah, some government involvement in private industries, like the meatpacking industry when it comes down to food that people are eating, that's a good thing. And so, Upton Sinclair is probably the most famous muckraker, talking about all the horrors of the meatpacking industry. And then the government got more involved. And there's quite a few muckrakers at the time that forced the United States government to get more involved in private industry. Edward Bellamy talked about looking backward. He wrote a whole nother book about the need for the government to get involved, but kind of outside the scope of this course. Jacob Riis, he writes a book called How the Other Half Lives. So, Mark Twain, that we talked about, coined the phrase, the Gilded Age. Mark Twain says, man, I tell you what, people love reading about the rich people. And still present, they love reading about the rich people, Rockefeller and Carnegie, and what they do with all their money. And the newspapers constantly want to talk about it because people want to read about it. Well, Jacob Riis, there's a new piece of technology that has come out called flash photography. So we had talked about in the Civil War, they had cameras, but it had to be very still for a very long time. And that's why they took pictures of like battlefields after the war with the dead bodies, because obviously dead bodies are going to stay still. Flash photography has come out where you can instantaneously take pictures and just like today, like instantaneous. So Jacob Riis makes a book called How the Other Half Lives and just like runs up into people's apartments and runs through the poorest parts of America and takes pictures of just the horrific poverty. He's like, oh, y'all want to talk about how the rich people live all the time. Let's talk about how the other half lives. All right. And there's tons of pictures. And these are a lot of times, these are kids just in the middle of the night. Just, they're sleeping in an alley. Like, there's no, it's unimaginable. This is a tenement in a city that all these men are packed in here together. There's probably no heat. So they had to have all these people in here at the same time for body heat. Not that they could afford anything else. These are kids, like, literally, like, dressed in rags, working at a factory where the owner's making just ridiculous amounts of money. This is another picture here. Kids are asleep. Now with the flash photography, kind of looks like the daytime, but this is all new. All right. Just pure on. And the thing about this is basically the sewer system that these people are living in, is why this picture is so horrific. When this gets out to the world, the government's like, oh my gosh, like, have we let the people down here? They, like, our entire government, who at this point, is a little over 100 years old. this is not the world that we envision. Like, everybody should have the ability to move up. But these monopolies, they're aggressively keeping any of these people that are in this book from being successful because of the way they have controlled society. And then this woman, Ida Tarbell. So Rockefeller and Carnegie, I know this, people like rich people because hooray, they won at being American. So even though people see the stuff that's happening in Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, they still are kind of questioning whether or not Rockefeller and Carnegie are even bad guys. Like what have they actually done wrong, though? Like, let's not make them the enemy here. They haven't actually done anything wrong. And Ida Tarbell comes out and says, oh, hold on there. And Ida Tarbell writes a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. She writes, obviously, she calls it The History of the Standard Oil Company. This is of Rockefeller's company. So her father tried to create an oil company, and Rockefeller completely ruined him and did all types of illegal stuff to keep him from being successful. And Ida Tarbell goes through and writes a book documenting all the shady and illegal stuff that Rockefeller has done that everybody just ignores because he's super rich. It says Rockefeller and his associates did not build the Standard Oil Company. In the boardrooms of Wall Street banks, they fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage and price cutting, and ruthless efficiency of organization. What that means is it is cutthroat. Like, they aggress. It's not just like they're rich and they're like, well, we're just better than everybody else. If they want to be successful, they can go do it themselves. They aggressively stop anybody from coming out and competing with them, effectively eliminating the American dream in any of the industries that have one of these robber barons in it, which at the time, every industry had a robber baron in it. So it really makes it impossible for people to move up. Ida Tarbell calls him out for it. This typically would be super dangerous, but since Rockefeller has financially, they're not sending out hit squads, I wouldn't think. But Rockefeller has already kind of destroyed her family before she wrote this book, and that's why she's writing the book, to basically call him out on all the illegal practices. This piques the interest of the United States government, and they're like, ooh, maybe we do need to look into this more. So the question here is, what do you think was so influential about Upton Sinclair and Jacob Riis's books that helped motivate the United States government to start getting involved in private businesses? Like, Jacob Riis and Upton Sinclair didn't present anything that wasn't already there. What do you think, in your opinion, why were they so influential that the United States government started to take an active role in it? Like, what was it about their specific writings that caused that? So pause me, answer that completely. Moving on. All right. Unions. So if you heard me mention a little earlier, why can't people just go demand more money from the boss? Well, they'll be fired. So what you could do instead is, if everybody at the factory, all 1,000 workers at this factory, says, we're not working until we're paid a quarter a day, and they all got together and says, we won't work, the owner could lose a bunch of money if they refuse to work. So if they all did that and they joined together, that's called a union. That is really good for the workers, and it kind of forces the owners to pay them more if they're all willing to go on strike at the same time. Strike means you refuse to work until you're paid more. Unions only work if everybody joins together simultaneously. One or two people say, I'm not going to work if you don't pay me more, they'll get fired. If everybody says, none of us are going to work until we get paid more, that's beneficial for the workers, but the owners hate it with a passion. Unions start forming at this time, and owners actively try to stop it. But unions form to try to better working conditions, either safer practices, not making 8-year-olds work 18 hours a day, better pay. These are the things that the unions want, but all of that costs the owners money. So owners hate unions because no matter what, unions cost the owners money. So owners try to actively stop unions from forming, whereas the workers who create unions, it is really nothing but beneficial, generally speaking, for the workers at this time. So the question here is, explain who likes unions and who dislikes unions, and explain why each side feels this way. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So we need to talk about some unions that are very influential at the time. The first one, and you'll hear these referenced a lot in DBQs and readings, is the Knights of Labor. So the Knights of Labor was the first national union, all right? So they were in all types of, so if you want to join a union, instead of just having your union in your factory, you could join an already existing union, and the most common one was the Knights of Labor. Of course, your whole factory would have to join the Knights of Labor, but this is a strike where the Knights of Labor are demanding that the owners pay that specific factory more money, or shorter working hours, or child labor laws, whatever their demands are for that particular factory before they go back to work. Well, so the Knights of Labor were the most well-known union around, and the working class people like unions. Then something crazy happens. There is this situation in Chicago. The McCormick Reaper Works factory. The workers go on strike, but strikes a lot of times then turned aggressive, as does this one. And there's a thing that happens when the McCormick Reaper Works factory goes on strike. They're in an area called the Haymarket Square. So the people are there, refusing to work. There's a lot of tensions between the owners. The police come in to keep the peace, whatever that is, and somebody from the Knights of Labor chucks a grenade into the middle of the police, killing a bunch of police. It turns into a riot. A lot of people are arrested. People go to prison for this. But what happens is, the police, they're working class people too. The fact that the Knights of Labor threw a grenade at the police made the Knights of Labor uncool. And all of a sudden, the Knights of Labor disbanded. And there is no more Knights of Labor. They're the largest union in the United States. Literally, to signify this event is why the holiday Labor Day exists. What happens is now there's a void. There is no more National Labor Union. So nobody really knows what to do. And a group comes out called the American Federation of Labor. It's like, we got you. And the American Federation of Labor, they only take in skilled workers. So the vast majority of people that work in these factories are not skilled. Basically, if you can learn how to do your job in 2 weeks, you're not a skilled worker. So a lot of times these are like welders or people that like have been apprentice in a long time. And it's a very small group that joins the American Federation of Labor. And then they say, hey, all our welders are not going to work. These are specialized people that the factory desperately needs. And so the problem with the Knights of Labor, why this hurts the unskilled workers, is the Knights of Labor took unskilled and skilled workers. So if the Knights of Labor went on strike, the skilled and unskilled workers stopped working. The skilled workers are very important. For the American Federation of Labor to only take in the skilled workers, it really screws all the unskilled workers at the time. And they're like, what are we supposed to do? So the American Federation of Labor kind of fills that void for the skilled workers. And then a group comes out called the Industrial Workers of the World. The Industrial Workers of the World become wildly huge almost overnight. Massively dwarfs anything the Knights of Labor ever were. And everybody in these factories around the country start joining the Industrial Workers of the World that's headed by this guy, Eugene Debs. So what is unique about this? Well, Knights of Labor only let white males in. Industrial Workers of the World lets women, children, African Americans, immigrants, literally anybody that wants to join the union that's a worker can join. By doing this, the Industrial Workers of the World become massive overnight and are led by this guy, Eugene Debs, and there becomes very quickly a power struggle between the owners and the Industrial Workers of the World, which is good for the workers because there used to not be a struggle and the owners should just do whatever they wanted to the unions. So the unions come out part of the progressive era that really benefits the workers. So the question here is, Why did the industrial workers of the world do? What did they do that allowed them to become more powerful than the Knights of Labor ever were? Basically, what did they do that allowed them to get more members than any other union to that point in time? So answer that completely. That's what I got for you guys today. See y'all tomorrow.